Did you know that over 10% of Americans struggle with addiction to drugs and alcohol every year, and over 35% struggle with anxiety and depression? It's your boy, Penny Kraz, and this is Soulber Podcast. Every week, we will be bringing you stories of trials, tribulations, and triumph in the recovery and addiction world, plus important lessons you can bring out of them, whether you're in recovery or not. This week, we have a very special guest, Eli Nash. He is a very respected member of the recovery community, and we're here to hear his story today. Eli?
Hey, thanks for having me. I didn't know there were respected members of the recovery community. I'm supposed to be anonymous.
So let's, what did your journey look like?
Which part? Getting into addiction or getting
Getting
more
into,
recovery? Recovery
getting
or addiction?
into, getting into addiction, and then we'll jump into the recovery.
Right. So I consider myself a card-carrying sex addict, porn addict, etc. It started at a fairly young age. Like all addictions, they kind of escalate. A few people start by injecting heroin with a needle, right? It starts like over time, maybe a little bit of alcohol or wine and then progressing. And the same is true with sex addiction. So in my case, it started with catalogs that showed up to my family's home, regular clothing catalogs with a lingerie section. And at 11, 12, 13 years old, I became obsessed with these and started stashing them. I had a magic mailbox in my house, which would deliver all these wonderful catalogs. And I just made sure, looking back at it, it's like, wow, it's pretty obvious it was an addiction, but obviously while I was doing it, I didn't think of it that way at all. As a matter of fact, it took me years, even after multiple suggestions from therapists and others, that I may have a addiction to pornography and sex in general, that I do have an addiction. But looking back, like I said, it's pretty clear I was hiding these magazines all over my house. So I had access to it, and every once in a while, you upgrade what that is, right? So whether it's a Victoria's Secret magazine, which is a little bit more bold than some of the other stuff, and there was a Sports Illustrated swimsuit, and then eventually, I grew up in the 90s. So right around that time, AOL Instant Messenger, right? Dial-up, the internet starting, and with that, just the access to pornography, and that obviously is a spigot. It's really turned on the spigot, and it just kept escalating year to year. More porn. As I got older, had a little bit more access. That included prostitution and a lot of other habits that I got into. And one day I decided to try to stop. I got in a relationship, and I knew this wasn't going to work in a relationship. And the first time I tried to stop, I realized that it wasn't humanly possible for me to stop. And that's how I got into recovery.
Like what kind of went through your head that first time you tried to jump into recovery?
So I have maybe a journey that's slightly different than others, in that at a very young age, and 5 years before recovery, I started going to therapy. And originally I was dealing with childhood stuff. I was abused sexually as a child, and I went to therapy to deal with that. So for about 4 or 5 years, I was in therapy working through those things and some family of origin stuff, and just seeing how our childhood stuff or our traumas affect our everyday life, whether it's business or relationships or friendships or anything under the sun. And 4 or 5 years into that journey, during all that time, I continued watching pornography and my habits and all of that. That didn't change. However, when I got into a relationship, I then realized that, okay, this doesn't work anymore. Let me try to stop. So when I was trying to stop, I was in therapy. I had some framework for these conversations, and the therapist had also suggested multiple times that I may have a problem here, but I put up a wall around it. So the way it really started was just walking back into the therapist and say, hey, you brought up a couple of times that I may be addicted. This may be an addiction for me. Or I'm using it as a crutch, and it's not just about sex. Let's talk about that. And he gave me a book to read, and he introduced me to someone who was in recovery for sex addiction. And that's, slowly over a couple of weeks, months, it became clear to me that I needed to get help in a way that was well beyond recovery. And that's how I joined recovery groups, support groups.
But so like after you got into recovery, when did you start speaking around and trying to help others with the problem that you've had and that you've healed yourself from, or not healed yourself, that you've took control of, because you never really heal from an addiction.
Mm-hmm. Right. So my first talks were not actually about addiction. My first talks were about the abuse, but it was after I got into recovery. So what happened is I'd been working on the abuse that I had suffered as a child for many years, and one of the first ideas that was planted in me by my therapist was that if I could meet my abuser and sit down and talk with him, it could potentially be very healing for me. And while I'm not giving a blanket recommendation for everyone who's been abused by someone to go through the same process, for me it turned out to be very healing. But that journey took many years to eventually get him to agree to have that conversation. And that only happened right after recovery. Prior to recovery, I actually had this incredible fear of public speaking. I did not like talking. I didn't talk in front of more than a few people, even in my office, company, dinner tables with friends. It just wasn't my style. It was one-on-one, one-on-two. I'd have a conversation. I would not talk in large settings. I had a terrible fear, and I never thought to challenge it. The first time it was challenged in a real significant way was when I started going to meetings. A lot of these meetings ask you to share. My sponsors ask me to share, and there's 15, 20, 25, 30 people in the meeting. So as I started overcoming that fear, I'm like, wow, this is pretty cool that I can do this now, that I'm actually not as nervous about speaking in front of a group. I had the opportunity to sit down with my abuser, and it was transformational. I mean, the day that I sat down with him, and a therapist, and we sat down for 3 hours, and I was able to turn him from monster to human, and just kind of right size the situation, put it into much better perspective, a profoundly healing moment. And after I experienced that, I said, wow, I got to share this with the world. I got to tell the world that this is possible. Like, I didn't feel the same way as I did the day before. And that's where the bug to start talking came to me.
You didn't have that hatred burning up inside of you after
A
that.
lot of the anger disappeared after I sat down with him.
So I have a
It wasn't
question.
only anger, fear too. I had an
Yeah.
intense fear of him as well, and that went away as well.
Yeah, because to you, you saw him as a monster, not a person.
Mm-hmm.
But so I was talking the other day with a guy that I had on here. His name is Chris, and he was saying how the recovery sector kind of needs to be rebooted because the way they heal shame is with shame. I wanted to hear what you thought of that.
I'd have to hear some explanation for what he means by that.
So instead of kind of healing addiction with love and compassion, they heal addiction with shame, because intentionally the addiction you have is shame, because you're ashamed that you have that addiction, because people
What
look
addiction
down.
was he referring to?
Here's alcohol, drugs, sex,
And he found that people were trying to heal the addiction with shame?
treatment centers. We're trying to heal the addiction with shame.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I mean, it might be a specific treatment center that he went to. I can tell you that my TED Talk is literally about combating shame. It wasn't really about addiction. It was about overcoming shame, and that it's necessary. It's a necessary part of healing, whatever someone is trying to heal from. Almost, I don't want to say whatever, but almost anything that someone's just trying to heal from, there's going to be a significant component of shame to it. Shame, according to some psychologists, is the single biggest cause of psychological issues. You talk about like across the spectrum, right? You talk about narcissism, you talk about borderline personality disorder, you talk about a lot of these mainstream problems, even a lot of anxiety. A lot of it comes, if you navigate through it, it comes down to shame. Addiction as well, a lot of it is rooted in shame. So I don't know that it's possible to recover from addiction without avoiding shame. Like using shame
No,
doesn't
so,
work.
so what I mean by that is, of course, you have to get. I've been to treatment a bunch of times, and you have to get to the shame to heal. But what I mean is healing shame with shame, making you ashamed that you have the shame, making you feel less than because you have that shame.
Can you give me a practical example?
Practical example. I'll give you an example of myself. When I was in treatment and in groups or even therapists, you tell them a story, something that happened to you or something that you've been through in your time in addiction or my time in addiction. And instead of like telling me that you can heal from this and like giving me coping skills to deal with it, they'll tell me that, so you did this, that's a horrible thing to do. You're a bad person for that. Like a lot of treatment centers that I know are using that method to try to heal by thinking that if we tell him that, okay, he's going to realize he's a shitty person and he has to change.
So, I wasn't in that treatment center, so I can't speak to it. My experience was exactly the opposite, and my approach to healing and the people who I work with, whether I'm sponsoring someone or someone reaches out to me for help, it's always the exact opposite. I always try to find a way to limit shame, and I'll give you an example for that. So, but listen, I mean, sometimes something happens in a treatment center or in a treatment modality that isn't necessarily the way it's meant to be in its origin. It just kind of, people are people and people sometimes screw systems up. So here's an example of how this guy felt shame from someone else in recovery, communicated the story to me, and I felt like I was able to help him navigate it in a much less shameful way. So, very often in addiction, there's a lot of other things going on, but we kind of got to be good liars to be addicts, right? It's part of the
True.
it's a double life. It is what it is. It's a double life. So a guy who's relatively new to recovery, 4 or 5 months in, calls me up and he says he's feeling a lot of shame because earlier that day he really wanted to get the vaccine, and he showed up there and they said, well, you're too young to get the vaccine, but he said he's a pilot or something, or an Uber driver, I forgot what he said. And he finagled his way in and he eventually got the shot. And he was sharing this with someone in recovery. He was like, dude, you can't do that. Like, you're taking away the shot of someone else who may need it. And he felt really guilty. After that, he felt really guilty over it and he was feeling really down. So he asked me, he mentioned this story to me, and I said to him, I said, I think it's great. He said, "Why is it good? Like, it's great that I cut in line." And I said, "No." I said, "I think it's great that you're feeling like that's not who you want to be, like that you're feeling badly about it. I think that's awesome." So he said, and that's not the same as shame, right? To feel badly about something is not the same as shame, which is, there's guilt and shame, right? Guilt is I did
Yeah.
bad, and shame
Is
is
I
I am
am
bad,
bad.
right? Someone, like, you screwed up. That's, you're a messed up person. That's where shame comes in. It's, hey, that's not who I want to be anymore. That's not shame.
That's
But
good.
that's what he was like, how can I be this kind of person? How could I have done this? Like, what is wrong with me that I was comfortable lying in order to get something when someone else potentially needed it, who was in a riskier situation? And, I sit there like I busted up the system. Here, the system is working in a certain way. It's designed for a specific purpose. And here I am, like the arrogance and the, um, deceit in order to get what I wanted. And what I asked him was, I said, let me ask you a question. I said, 6 or 7 months ago, if you were in the same situation and you did this pre-recovery, would you feel any guilt whatsoever? He said, no, I wouldn't feel any. He said, it was just, that's who I am. That's who I was. I said, so that's awesome. This is like a ton of progress, right? 6 months ago, you do the same thing, you feel nothing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just who I am. It's normal everyday life. I got to get mine. Other people got to get theirs. Let them figure it out. No problem lying. Suddenly, a lie doesn't fit for the guy. It doesn't make him bad. That makes him good.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work with him anymore. So that's just an example, an anecdotal example of ways I think that we need to combat shame in recovery, not by giving the guy a pass, right? It's not saying, oh, what you did was good and go ahead and do it next time, but it's finding that kernel of goodness that sits in the person and trying to highlight that.